Welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for coming to our session today, Latin America at the Crossroads, the region's emergence as a key stage for global power competition. My name is John Bussey. I'll be your moderator today. And let me just very quickly introduce the panel. I do want to say that this is interactive. We will kind of wrap things up with plenty of time for questions from the audience. Your interaction, please, if you have a question, ask it. If you want to disagree with one of the speakers, even better. So we look forward to your involvement. Joining us today are sort of three experts on not just Latin America, but on power play by large nation states around the world. Vice Admiral Hervé Amelin, who's the General Officer in charge of international military relations at the General Staff of the French Armed Forces. Martin Vladimirov, he's the Director of the Geoeconomics Program at the Center for the Study of Democracy in Sofia, Bulgaria. Brian Fonseca, the Director of the Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University in the United States. So I think what we do is maybe start with kind of a scene setter, if we could. I'd just like to ask each of you to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes kind of giving your thoughts on the following. Latin America has been a battleground for great powers in the past, particularly the Cold War, the US and Russia. But that power play now seems to be much more robust, with China in the game, Iran in the game, criminal gangs and organized crime in the game. So could each of you sort of give us the lay of the land in your sort of view of the competing interests of the power? What are the interests of the countries in Latin America engaging with these external authoritarian regimes? Is this just an opportunistic one-off arrangement by these countries, or is it a deeper integration? Admiral, maybe we could start with you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I'm very glad and honored to share this panel with honorable speakers. Maybe before just getting to the external powers, maybe it's interesting just to have a look at the regional stakes on which external powers play. The evolving security architecture in Latin America is, I think, best characterized by not as unified a system, but more a fragmented system, with still an instability based on competition still on borders, on resources, on expanding to reach, with, of course, the transnational illicit actors that are at play. There is an obvious link between transnational actors, non-state actors, and state actors. At the global level, major powers are competing to secure access to resources, of course, and influence, control of strategic infrastructures, and Latin America has plenty of resources and has infrastructure on less other continents. And of course, shape political alignments on the global scene, placing Latin America at the heart of the Sino-American rivalry, but still with Russia there. The recent operations conducted by the US, notably Absolute Resolve in Venezuela, have marked a turning point in this state competition with its peer competitors, China and Russia, faced with China's, I think, ever-growing economic power on influence in the area. China is the top partner for Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Peru, and also faced with a resilient and political influence from Russia, with their allies, Cuba, Nicaragua, and still a little bit Venezuela. So the US, in that context, has chosen to reassert the preeminence of the Western Hemisphere and strengthen the US hegemony on a continent on which they had already had an influence before, but maybe that was probably less on the scope recently, and that's the so-called Donroe doctrine. We'll probably talk about that. So drug trafficking is also a very important thing that is still happening, and on which it's basing probably the shift in the competition. The portage among United States, China, Russia on non-state actors reveals that political fragmentation in Latin America. Those who probably say we have to align with the US, those who consider they want to remain neutral are looking for another way, and of course those will be opposing this primacy. And the absence of Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Uruguay to the Joint Declaration on Security highlights a growing divide between the conservative Noboa Cast Milei bloc on one side and the Petrolula axis, more reluctant toward military intervention backed by Washington.
Martin?
Well, I think that the Latin American region is experiencing a profound geoeconomic shift over the last 2 decades. If we compare trade partnerships 20 years ago, at the beginning of this millennium, you would see that the biggest trading partner of all countries in the hemisphere was the United States, with few exceptions. 2 decades later, it's China. China has invested more than $220 billion, mostly in key strategic sectors, infrastructure, energy, manufacturing, critical raw materials. And gradually, the key role that the US has had in the economic development, or the foundations of the economic development of these countries, has been, the US involvement has been replaced with China. And on top of that, you have had a growing presence of Russia, which of course doesn't have the economic muscle of China, and is trying to play a spoiler and trying to kind of undermine US presence in specific countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. But it has been also able to lock in countries in asymmetric relationships, which are usually low cost, but they are very much targeting the leadership in these countries. So, so that these governments cannot really escape the Kremlin grip. And so China and Russia are increasingly cooperating, I think, in undermining this US influence. And I think until the beginning of last year, until the second Trump administration, we haven't really seen a counter push from the US to these practices. So I think now China and Russia are a little bit stunned by what's going on. So let's see whether they're going to adapt. So I think the balance is still not clear whether it's shifting in the opposite direction. And it's very important that this coercion tactic that the US is using is not going to backfire and push countries even closer to China and Russia. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing what Brian would say on this issue.
Brian.
No, thanks so much. And first and foremost, CSD, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. So let me tackle, John, the question about sort of US competitors and sort of American geopolitical rivals in Latin America, and maybe talk a little bit about their respective interests in the region, as I've sort of observed it over the last 2 decades. So in the context of China, China's inroads to Latin America, largely in the 21st century, has been largely as a result of fundamentally 4 things. First is China's access to resources. And starting in the early 2000s, China made a huge inroads into Latin America in the pursuit of natural resources to continue to sustain its own growth. So whether that's deepening relationships with Brazil or Argentina, even Bolivia, Peru, it was really about extracting resources from Latin America in an effort to continue to sustain its growth. That's number 1. Number 2 was access to markets for Chinese goods. So as China was rising and producing massive amounts of cheap goods for the world, it needed markets to continue to proliferate those goods, and it found opportunities to sort of outcompete in spaces like Latin America. So I think that was 2. So I think 2 of the most important sort of drivers of Chinese engagement in Latin America were fundamentally economic. The 3rd and 4th are largely geopolitical. The 3rd was really pursuing an opportunity to outcompete Taiwan in Latin America. So in part of the 21st century, you had dozens of, just over 2 dozen countries in the world that recognized Taiwan's sovereignty. half of those countries existed in Latin America. And so China made a huge push into Latin America in an effort to isolate those countries and essentially pursue the one China policy and have countries continue to repel their recognition of Taiwan sovereignty. And so today, you still have about half the countries that recognize Taiwanese sovereignty in Latin America, but they're largely in the Caribbean, small Caribbean islands, Central America, and one exception in South America is Paraguay. And so that's been a major push for China. And I think fourth has been sort of the geopolitical power competition with the United States. China saw an opportunity to move into spaces in which the United States wasn't proactively engaged in Latin America. And by the way, that's not to suggest that the United States has been disengaged. It's just oftentimes the US government has been engaged in other priority areas, like where the fires are. And largely, Latin America has been a product of US private sector engagement, civil society engagement, people-to-people contact. And so the United States has been engaged collectively, but I think the US government didn't have fundamental priority in Latin America, sort of chasing Afghanistan, Iraq, for example, for most of the 21st century so far. And so I think that led to China moving in spaces in which the United States was not active. And in fact, if you read sort of Chinese white papers from the early 2000s, it was about going to spaces in which the United States was not active so they didn't have to confront the United States directly. This was about occupying important geopolitical, economic, and security spaces. And I think the Chinese have done that incredibly well. And we can unpack where it is today, because I think it's really important to sort of look at the evolution of Chinese political and economic engagement, and security engagement particularly. So that's the sort of Chinese context. It's about resources, access to markets, isolation of Taiwan, and of course, opportunities to compete with the United States. Russia, on the other hand, has been a little bit more opportunistic. Russia has been engaged in the region deeply for a very long time, but more substantively, certainly since Hugo Chavez, when he was in power in Venezuela, sort of reintroduced Russia into the region, I think in more substantive ways. Russia was there for a few reasons as well. One was certainly to poke a finger in the eye of the United States, right? You can think, by the way, earlier periods to Cuba, sort of inviting Russia into the region as part of the sort of Cold War experience. But more contemporary, it's been about, again, poking a finger in the eye of the United States, getting the United States to sort of obsess about Russia's engagement. Beyond that, limited economic engagement, but in the areas of like oil, gas, uranium, and then of course markets for weapon sales. That's been a big part of Russian engagement, but again, it's been largely opportunistic. Iran, on the other hand, sort of one of the other actors that we talk about in the region, has been far more tactical. For Iran, it's not been massive economic investments. It's been searching for some allies in the world. And they found that in Hugo Chavez and sort of Venezuela, bringing Iran in, and then deepening relations in countries like Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, even as far as Argentina, which seems somewhat ironic given the large Jewish population in Argentina. But I've always characterized sort of Iran's relationship as a bit more tactical. Opportunities to build some type of relationships globally because it's been isolated from the West, and saw opportunities to do that. That's one. And then two, you could probably make the case for intelligence collection against Israel and sort of chasing Israel back and forth, IRGC, the Mossad around the region. You've seen that sort of dance play out over the last 2 decades as well. Anyway, that's sort of a characterization of those countries' interest in the region, and we can certainly unpack where that is today if you want, John.
Admiral, so we have authoritarian nations in Latin America lining up with authoritarian nations interested in intruding into Latin America. How do democratic nations reverse that trend? Is there a role for the military? Arguably some of the organized crime has already subverted sovereignty in these nations. How do democratic nations respond to this without, as Martin pointed out, pushing these countries deeper into the fold of Russia, China, Iran?
Yeah, it's a great question because, of course, the question is what do we do on that? Is there a relation between this economic pressure that China is putting there on the big geopolitical game that China is playing with the US and with other countries? Just to say one example, if you take the Moroni River is between Suriname and the French Guyana. You have more than 120 trade desks there that participate to the illegal mining, gold mining in the area. And this feeds all the systems there. The drug trafficking, of course, is bringing a lot of money, and this is very interesting to get arms and weapons. And as the previous speaker said, there is a direct link between the contracts that you have for China, for on the long-term investments, on the dependencies they create with the local countries. These interactions, they create not only economic but also political dependencies, and we talk about Taiwan. And Russia is also playing that game at the UN, using the veto and the support of some countries. And so this is probably having a holistic view on all the stakes in Latin America, including human and disaster relief, because this is, especially for the Caribbean, an area where any weakness can be used by your advisors to put pressure or gain support from the countries. This translates in of course, direct access. We talk about the access. The access has also a dual way. When you have a port in Peru for China, this civilian infrastructure can be used tomorrow for something else. And so this is that holistic picture that has to be taken into account. For democratic countries, how do we act? Of course, is with the tools we have. And this is probably where there is a slight difference on the views on how we do it with the US. We've had a long experience of cooperation between Europeans, Americans, on our neighbors. France is neighbor to Brazil, is in the Caribbean, working with the Netherlands, working with the Spanish and the UK. And drug trafficking has always been something interagency on which we have been working. Helping country to have a clean financial system has always been something we have worked on. And honestly, there has been a lot of improvements. When you look at the democracy in South America, you have change of governments that go from left to right, recently Chile. This is a healthy environment on which we can build as long as we support the states themselves to deal with the problems they have.
Martin, your thoughts on this? A role for a more coercive stand by democratic nations?
Well, I think that the EU and the US should cooperate much more effectively on some of these also irregular warfare practices. Hybrid warfare has become one of the main tools that both Russia and China and Iran are using in the region, weaponizing even transnational organized crime to undermine kind of the US presence there, or to undermine democratically elected governments in the region. And so we have been monitoring over the past decade how Russia, for example, how it securitizes these relationships in order to create space for more influence on strategic decision-making, on kind of changing the foreign policy orientation of these countries. And specifically, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen a massive influx of Russian security services networks in places like Mexico, Argentina, because they're no longer welcome in Europe. So in a way, after expelling them from embassies across the continent, they have found refuge in Latin America, and I think Europe and the US need to work together on mapping some of these networks, countering their activities, countering their travel, their movements around the world. In our conversation before the panel, we discussed how some of these bases for security services are then used for activities in places like Africa, Asia, and so with the illicit flows of mining, so of resources, of drugs, you also have the flows of these irregular warriors. And so I think Europol would play a key role on the EU side to kind of stem some of these flows, and better coordination with US DEA or with FinCEN, because in many cases it's about following the money. So these illicit flows of goods, arms, etc., they are accompanied by huge movements of money. And of course, Latin America has been a safe haven for illicit financial flows, especially in the Caribbean. For example, we have seen a 10% increase in Russian illicit financial flows to the Caribbean after the war started. And so in many cases, you see a collusion between criminal networks and state networks in these activities. And without a common global approach to countering that, it will be very difficult to stop these movements. Yeah.
Brian, meanwhile, the U.S. is about America first, interests over values. Help us understand what's now driving U.S. statecraft.
Thanks, John. So let me. I think there are three things that I've observed from the current Trump administration in terms of its approach to foreign policy, and I think one is exactly what you said, John. It's interests over values. So I think that the United States has been pretty. And again, I'm an academic, so I don't speak on behalf of the U.S. government, but I'm happy to tell you my interpretation, and we can certainly debate and have fun during the Q&A session. But this is what I interpret as being sort of how the U.S. is approaching not just Latin America, but sort of its broader foreign policy portfolio, and that's one, its interests over values. And so if you look at the Americas, for example, its pursuit of things like countering drug trafficking seems to be taking a priority over things like democratic resilience and human rights, for example, right? I mean, what the United States has done with Bukele in El Salvador, the push to leverage military institutions to take a more proactive role in aggressively addressing the drug trafficking issue, I think are sort of indicative of the U.S. saying, we're going to pursue our interests first and foremost. That doesn't mean that the U.S. is abandoning the idea of democracy. It just means that, again, in its prioritization, things like stabilization and sort of leveraging the broad arrangement of instruments of power to pursue its foreign policy, I think is at the forefront. So whether that's for the United States and Latin America, whether that's, again, displacing Russia, China, and Iran from the region, combating drug trafficking, addressing illegal migration or irregular migration through the region, the United States has put that as sort of its priority in terms of the region. More so than things like in the past, like defense or institution building and democratic resilience and human rights. I think that's taken sort of a second seat to some of the primary interests. And so that's the interest over values. Number two is I think the U.S. is right now, very comfortable using coercion as part of its proactive statecraft. And what that means is the United States is not going to use coercion as reciprocative. It's using coercion out the gate. It's using, the world has experienced that in the early period of the Trump administration with the levying of tariffs around the world, right? It's about coercive instruments of power, whether that's economic or in the case of Venezuela, the military, or Iran, the military. So this is the U.S. saying it's unapologetically going to use coercion in pursuit of its foreign policy interests. That's two. Three is the U.S. sees multilateralism as strategic risk. So you brought up the point of the shield of the Americas Summit, which is a great point. There were 3 countries noticeably absent from that convening 10 minutes from my office in Miami. It was the absence of Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. Now, here's what's interesting. The countries that showed up at the summit were all countries that already have strategic alignment with the Trump administration. They want deeper relations with the Trump administration. They're relatively aligned with U.S. interests, as it's stated now. And so the U.S. was saying, we're not looking to make this a discussion. We're bringing countries that we already know are online, and we're going to move this forward. What wasn't necessarily in the press a lot was that the Trump administration met with met with Petro the month before. There's an open invitation to Lula to come to the White House. The United States supplied critical intelligence to Scheinbaum in the pursuit of El Mencho. And so that means that the United States is saying, we're going to use multilateralism when it makes sense. Otherwise, we're going to abandon that. We're going to use bilateral engagement. And so I think that's where the U.S. sort of sees this concept of multilateralism as risk. They don't want to negotiate their interests. They want to pursue their interests. And so they felt if they brought those countries together, which, by the way, we're supposed to have the Summit of the Americas in December, and that was abandoned largely because the United States didn't want to debate what it was doing. It's bringing the countries together that are in line with its interests and pursuing sort of collective arrangements on one end, and then it's engaging bilaterally with the countries that it has a little bit more tension in terms of its foreign policy view or its interests in the region. And so I think those are 3 fundamental truths of how the U.S. is pursuing its interests in the region. If I can just take privilege and talk about the summit of the Shield of the Summit, because I think there's an interesting element in the Shield of the America Summit, and that was this was partly the United States also unlocking the military to go after what has been traditionally debated as domestic law enforcement activities, right? And so this is the US saying two things. One, we're going to support Latin American countries using the military domestically to target violently criminal organizations, which is hotly debated in Latin America because the roles militaries have played in terms of supplanting the state and becoming more, akin to political actors and more deeply, impactful roles. I think that's one. And number two, the U.S. saying we're going to give you the use of our military to also help you, which is a big departure. In U.S. policy in Latin America, the U.S. has been very apprehensive in terms of using military in the hemisphere, for all of the past sort of, reasons during the Cold War in which there were, violent confrontations between, left and right aligned countries in the region that led to, hundreds of thousands of deaths across the region. And so we've, for the most part, kept the U.S. military as a light footprint in Latin America, mostly engaged in things like defense institution building, mil-to-mil engagements, exercises. But in Ecuador recently, we helped drop bombs. I mean, so you're going to see the U.S. military more assertive on the ground in a kinetic way in the region. And I think that was part of what this Shield of the Americas summit was really unlocking.
So, Admiral, given what Brian just described as a more sort of animated American military presence in the region, how would you like to see a better coordination between European military operations or concerns in the Caribbean, let's just say, against the drug trafficking that's going on? How might coordination between Europe and the United States work better?
First, I would say we share same concerns. First, because Europeans are and I already said it before, but in Latin America, in the Caribbean. So we suffer from transnational organizations, criminal organizations. We suffer from all the drug trafficking and the operations. It's a flow. So when you put pressure somewhere, so it goes somewhere else, and that somewhere else is even more right now for the moment in the Caribbean. And so. So the first answer to your question is, first we have to probably better coordinate within Europeans. Looking at humanitarian disaster relief, same problems, whether you're in Curacao, in Martinique, Saint Martin, or all the other ones. We share a lot of intelligence, information, tools, and C2 with Netherlands and the UK, with the US, but we can probably improve the mechanisms in place, just starting with humanitarian disaster relief. When you go just one level above, about drug trafficking, we cooperate, France is cooperating with Colombia, and we, and as you said, of course, I'm more on the military side, but there's the civilian side with Europol, and the sharing of intelligence is working pretty well. And we have had a lot of successes working together with the US, with the Dutch, and with all countries in the area, including the regional countries. I said Colombia, for example. So there are some successes on which we can build. For the moment, the difficulty is more, and this is fundamental in the European mind, and this is probably also important in most of the Latin American states, is that international law. And of course, the interpretation you have, you can be more efficient, but be a little bit further away from what the states are ready and able to do. So this is the difficulty for the moment. But we share the same concerns. We do also, of course, multilateral. You were talking about multilateral. Of course, it's in the blood of Europe because of its size, but also because of its history. But also bilateral. We are working tightly with Brazil, with a neighbor, to counter all the threats we have. Talk about gold mine, but you have illegal fishing, you have a lot of stakes in the area. That needs a regional cooperation, but of course that regional cooperation depends on where you are exactly. So you have to adapt the answer you bring. So I think we have pretty much the mechanisms in place. It's more about policies on which we're working today that we need to align.
So would you have agreed with the United States on military use in Venezuela to remove Maduro?
That's more politics than just military stuff. That's not the way we do it. Looking at the results, everyone can see what it brought. But this is not the French way to do it. We think in international law, but of course the results are there.
Right. So that's
Can
not
I jump in just on this issue?
Yeah.
I think for many years we have avoided transactionalism in our relationship with many countries in the global south, not only in Latin America, but also Africa, Southeast Asia. And this has compromised the West's position there and its influence. And in a way, the coercive elements could be risky, but this risk can be kind of amended if we follow up with a carrot. So we have seen the stick, but what is the carrot? And an important carrot will be to bring some of these economies to the forefront of global economic development in cutting-edge sectors. So now the private investors need to come to Venezuela, to Argentina, to Bolivia, now that Bolivia has a different government that's pro-Western, and they can provide opportunities for rapid development. And based on this paradigm, we can also change governance processes. Because the next step would be, how can we solidify these democratically elected governments and strengthen democratic institutions so that they're more resilient to authoritarian pressure from places like China and Russia. But this cannot happen only via force. So there needs to be a mechanism to incentivize these countries to look forward to deepening their ties with Europe and the US.
So Brian, given what Martin just said, and also that a lot of countries would agree with the Admiral's embrace of the rule of law, the U.S. deposed one strongman and another stepped into his place in Venezuela. What happens now? How can the U.S. untangle the interests of Russia and China and Iran in Venezuela?
Yeah, and I think it's important to at least point out that Venezuela, particularly U.S. policy to Venezuela, was sort of stasis for more than 2 decades, right? The U.S. did virtually nothing to move the needle in terms of moving Venezuela away from authoritarian grips, right? Away from its involvement as a hub in the broader global transnational criminal enterprise. Not exclusively to the United States, that's been debunked, but certainly its role as a safe haven for a large sort of range of non-state actors, whether they're cartels or ELN and FARC on the border. They've created this passive environment. And I think that the Trump administration saw an opportunity to build on the Biden administration, which is interesting, but build on the Biden administration in terms of taking action. What I mean by that was, the U.S.'s position in terms of going into Venezuela was that it was pursuing a justice, right? It was going after an indicted narco-terrorist who had been indicted in the U.S. courts, and that it was going to serve justice by deposing him and bringing him to the United States. And I think that's the argument that the United States is going to sort of stand behind. It's tried to sort of blur the lines and say this was really a law enforcement operation that had military elements, but we all know that it was probably one of the most effective and impressive military operations that I've seen, and I had the privilege of serving in the U.S. military a long time ago. But I think, again, this was the U.S. saying, we're going to do something different. We're going to force some type of fracture within Venezuela. And I think this is what was happening. The United States was building up its military over the course of 6 months in the hopes that the threat of military force would create a fracture among the political elite, that the Venezuelan military, for example, might step in and seize power in order to try to assuage U.S. pressure. And then when that failed to work and negotiations with Maduro failed to work, the United States, as I said earlier, unapologetically unlocked the use of the military as a coercive instrument to go in and make some form of change. And when President Trump sort of at his presser the following hours after the operation, he stood before sort of the American people in the world, and he said the United States is going to now run Venezuela. And I think that was probably a really intentional word. He didn't say govern Venezuela, because that was how a lot of people interpret it. It was he was going to run Venezuela. And what that meant was he was going to use economic leverage. He was going to work on putting the Americans back on the ground in a very coercive way to control Venezuela's main economic engine, which is oil, and then look to shape political outcomes by controlling the economic levers of the state. That's what he meant by run. And so then sort of unlocks this path now, John, to where the United States is trying to push investment and incentivize investment into the oil sector. That's been a little bit more challenging, and the reason that's been challenging is because Western investors, particularly those that are a little less risk averse, are afraid of going in and then having some democratic change and then nulling all of the contracts that happened underneath the Delcy Rodriguez term. That was why the United States then sort of legitimized Delcy Rodriguez, but we still have a fundamental issue that the United States doesn't recognize the current National Assembly. It recognizes the 2015 National Assembly. And so there's been this sort of dance in Venezuela and US in which the opposition is saying, well, any contracts that happen now may be canceled when we come in because you're negotiating those contracts with an illegitimate government. And that's been sort of the challenge to move Western investment back in. And so Delcy Rodriguez just convened yesterday a big sort of group of potential investors, and you are having at least more interest. But I think that's been the fundamental challenge, is sort of moving Western investment. In fact, the two companies that got the first licenses to go operate in Venezuela was a Swiss and a Singaporean company. They weren't U.S. companies, which was not the spirit of what the Trump administration was trying to pursue. It wanted U.S. businesses to occupy this space so that the United States had leverage on the ground. But he found that those U.S. businesses were unwilling to take that sort of high-risk investment without the requisite, comfort of having, the recognition of a legitimate government in Venezuela and some protections for the respective investments. And so I think that's been the challenge. Going forward, I think the United States has signaled that it's still willing to leverage military if it needs to. It is leaning on Delcy Rodriguez to do two things. One, moderate or neutralize the hardliners, right? So to bring the more hardline elements of the regime closer to the middle, and then begin to set the foundation for a recalibration of democratic institutions, right? Venezuela still has democratic institutions, but they're hollowed out. They've been purged, with loyalists from the regime, and so the United States is looking to Venezuela to neutralize and moderate the hardliners, reestablish some semblance of pathway to democracy, which may include elections 1 to 2 years down the road, and then create space for the United States to have leverage on the ground, because for the last 2 decades, the United States has been absent. It's not had leverage on the ground, and so reasserting itself in this way is really designed to build some of that leverage so that it can continue to shape those other political outcomes.
Please.
Can I bounce on the fact that you said the American companies were reluctant to do it? I think it's, of course, there is the rule of law. This is the basic of the difference of how we see it. But there is also short-term versus long-term. As military, we work with end states. And of course, you have many ways to get to that end state. But sometimes we disagree on the end state. And are we able to achieve that end state? That was the case with the Houthis in the Red Sea, where naturally we wanted to be with the US and the UK, striking at the Houthis. But what can we reach? What can you really reach? And unless you can reach an effect that is that you can measure and you think you can get it, so we were reluctant to do it. And it's the same with that. What is the long-term effect? On the short term, you see the effect. It's political, but it also has a shock effect that can provoke the future. But is the private sector thinking it's good? It's a long-term assessment. What is the governance that is in place, etc.? A lot of questions. So I think this short-term, long-term is also part of the reflection. I'm talking to my European counterparts. We are very careful on the long-term effects, and that's why we try to have an approach that is more in the cooperation, and of course it's slower. I fully agree. That's slower. You're not even sure of the result either. but this is a path that is probably more comfortable for the partners. And so this is a different way of looking at things.
No, and I'll add that I think you're absolutely right. I mean, traditionally, that's you look at sort of the end state and you reverse and you go backwards. I've noticed in sort of conversations, and again, I won't name names, but this idea that the United States is focused more on short-term achievements. I mean, I saw this most notably in the context of Haiti, for example, where we had a discussion, and there's a wide range of representatives in the room to include representatives of the government, and sort of government's position is we're just looking to stabilize Haiti. That's it. We know that a lot more has to happen to get Haiti back, to a place of prosperity, but chasing that has evaded us for a very long time. And so we're just going to focus right now on stabilization. We're going to introduce the gang suppression force. We're going to retake Haiti from the gangs, and then we'll figure out where to go from there. Or let others, right, civil society and the international community deal with it. I think that's the similar context of Venezuela, right? In other words, we've spent decades and we've gotten absolutely nowhere, no change. And so we're going to disrupt it, and then we're going to see what happens from there. And then we'll continue to adapt to both the sort of internal dynamics of Venezuela and sort of the external international context of which that policy is unfolding. So while conventional wisdom is you work long-term backwards, I think the United States right now seems to be doing that inverted. It's working more in short-term, taking bites of the and then adjusting from there in an effort to pursue an end state that ultimately aligns with U.S. interests, whatever that ends up being. So I think that's one of the observations I'm making of sort of U.S. approach now too.
So, given the administration's new approach, is Cuba next? Should they be expecting a visit from Delta Force? The Cubans are suddenly willing to allow investment in the country from Cubans that are overseas. Maybe that's a bending out of concern to the U.S.'s new sort of coercive approach. What's to happen in Cuba?
Okay, so this is a tougher one for me. I live in Miami, which is as Cuban as it gets, right? Where the largest Cuban diaspora is certainly in the United States. I think that the short answer is probably. The United States is pursuing change in Cuba. But I don't think it's going to be the same sort of path that the Americans took in Venezuela. I think there's a couple of really important differences between Venezuela and Cuba that make Cuba a far more unique and difficult case, by the way. One is that there is no easily accessible democratic opposition to tap into for any type of potential trajectory. Right? No one in Cuba today remembers democracy. Right? We're talking 70 years of sort of the sort of Castro rule. And so there is no democratic opposition like there was in Venezuela with Maria Corina Machado. You had a democratic opposition that you could engage with and through. And even the democratic opposition in Venezuela is sort of somewhat aligned with where the U.S. is trying to go. And you've seen some acquiescence from Maria Corina Machado as well. The Cubans don't have that. There are democratic opposition, but they're fragmented. The government has been incredibly adept at sort of keeping from a cohesion, democratic opposition in Cuba. And so there isn't anyone to really tap into, any large sort of substantive body to tap into for some type of transition to democracy. That's number one. Number two, Cuba doesn't have an easily accessible, single, powerful industry that the United States or the world can tap into to rebuild the economy. In Cuba. It largely comprises tourism, right, with some exports, but it's nothing like the oil sector that the U.S. had to tap into in Venezuela. And I think the third one is that in the case of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez eroded democratic institutions during the first decade, 15 years of his rule, and then Maduro sort of scaled that and further deteriorated. But you have sort of hollowed out democratic institutions, and you have a relatively robust historical memory of democratic institutions too. We're talking about 10 to 15 years removed, from democracy, despite 25 years of rule by 27 almost by the current regime. In the case of Cuba, there are no democratic institutions. They don't exist, and so you're talking about a fundamental rebuilding almost entirely of democracy. And so I think the U.S. is approaching this very delicately. One, it wants to get Cuba to the point of breaking without breaking it. Because breaking Cuba means that the seas are going to be flooded with migration flowing to the United States, that the United States is going to have to then invest tons of money into into Cuba. And so the United States wants to get as close to breaking without breaking it and hope that there's a transitioning off-ramp that will get back to some form of, of elections and building a democratic opposition and beginning to recalibrate institutions. And so the case of Cuba is the administration is going to look for some significant tectonic shift to indicate change, that it can claim victory. Yes, we effected change. That's probably going to happen, I think, through the Cuban military. The Cuban military is probably the most important institution in Cuba today. It also controls, my assessment was about 35% of the Cuban economy. My colleagues tell me I'm wrong, and it's close to 100% of the Cuban economy. But the Cuban military has an incredible amount of influence over the economy. It's also a major political pillar in Cuba and sort of responsible for continuity of the revolution. And so I think the United States is going to have to try to find a way to fracture the military and move some members of the military out of uniform and into positions where they can help lead a transition in Cuba going forward. And I think that's going to make it more difficult. But I think that's what the U.S. is trying to do. Get it as close to breaking, find some negotiated off-ramps, begin for a longer-term transition, fracture the military to pull sort of the economic engines out of the military and give them back to sort of some semblance of the private sector, and then work on building a democratic opposition.
Martin, you've written in the Kremlin playbook about corrosive capital. What sectors in Latin America are most dependent upon authoritarian help at this point, that are most susceptible to some of that corrosive capital? Energy, mining, infrastructure, what are the areas that we should keep an eye on?
Yeah, energy, mining, infrastructure, you mentioned them. That's where you have seen most investment coming in from China, but also from Russia. And the playbook for both countries have been to lock these recipient nations in long-term asymmetric deals that are usually debt traps. So basically, these countries would have to somehow negotiate with either China and Russia to get out of these deals in the long run if they are to stabilize their economies. So this makes them very vulnerable to any kind of geopolitical shifts. So this is something that Venezuela would have to deal now, which owes roughly 17 billion to Russia and another 80 billion to China. And for it to not default, there needs to be some kind of a renegotiation of these agreements. But this is how I think China and Russia have been expanding their influence over decision-making on the strategic level. And especially, again, I must say, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this process has accelerated, because a lot of the corrosive capital has been looking for new avenues to develop and to grow. You have seen withdrawal from the West and investment in the global South. And so, for example, in areas such as fertilizers, Russia has basically wiped out the US from Brazil. And Brazil is one of the biggest importers of fertilizers in the world. China has locked in some of the biggest lithium, cobalt, zinc resources in the region. They have also invested in some of the biggest hubs for imports, such as the ports in Peru. And this presence is not going anywhere else. So the long game, because we talked a lot about the short game, the long game is how to incentivize constructive capital to re-enter the region. I think many governments are realizing that these no strings attached deals that they signed with China and Russia are actually going to buy them. And they need a different off-ramp themselves. And being more transactional, so for the US or Europe to come in and not ask for major democratization or liberalization reforms, but ask for alignment on strategic issues, is a better strategy to bring these governments to sign alternative agreements. I think a good test case would be Bolivia now, which exited, I think, a 15-year period semi-communist rule by mass. The new government is willing to reconsider some of these deals in the lithium sector, in nuclear, etc. And let's see if the US and Europe can come in and offer better tools. Argentina, I think, is also leading the way to show that there is an alternative pathway. And you can see President Milei's reforms has led to a significant decrease in inflation from 200% to, I think, less than 20% this year, and a high economic growth. And the countries in the area, they are seeing that this is working. So they were very skeptical in the beginning. So you can see a domino effect, and I think the US and Europe has to piggyback on that and try to push further these processes. China is not waiting on the sidelines. I think China has used this crisis in Venezuela to say, okay, we are the most reliable partner, but I don't think governments in the region have now the courage to go against, I would say, the revised Monroe Doctrine. They see the consequences of that. So in a Machiavellian way, I'm not saying if this is correct from an international law point of view or multilateralism, but from a Machiavellian point of view, it works. Because governments understand there are consequences from disconnecting from the US. And so I don't think many of these rulers are going to run the risk.
I want to go to questions from the audience, so have them in mind. But before I do that, let me just ask the panel to kind of, each of you very briefly, like in a minute or so, respond to this new American view of the region. It's the dominant player in the region. It is going to have a major effect in all of these countries, one way or another, if not through military intrusion, then through tariff legislation. Is the new posture by the United States a reaffirmation of the Monroe Doctrine, likely to engage nations in Latin America with the US on some common course, or is it likely to drive those countries that are already authoritarian more deeply into the hands of authoritarian players from outside the region? Brian, why don't we start?
Want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay.
A quick view.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, yes, I mean, this is about strategic denial for the United States. I will say that, my observations, the United States has been and remains the dominant actor in Latin America if you bring all of it, social, economic, political, and security together. Despite the fact that the Chinese have grown, incredibly, thick, and then there are some exception cases like, Cuba and Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia, in which other actors have taken a bigger role. But I think the United States has been dominant. I think the United States is looking at this and sort of to build on the Machiavellian, sort of from a very realist, sort of realpolitik. It's about, number one, in order to preserve your position as a global power, you need to have dominance in your hemisphere first. Right? And I think the United States is pursuing this clarity in terms of it is dominant in its hemisphere first. And if you look at the other actors and you sort of subscribe to this idea that we're in a multipolar system today, in which you have Russia and China, sort of other major actors, then the United States is looking to play defense at home. In other words, be the dominant actor in Latin America, and then force, sort of, at least in Asia, sort of force, China to do a little bit more defending of the Asian continent.
But how will that cause nations in Latin America to behave or change?
Again, nations are going to have to navigate the complexity of this environment. And I think what you're going to find is that they're in between, one, acquiescence to the United States as sort of a dominant power against sort of China as being the sort of big power in the region that's challenging the United States, and then sort of in the context of democracy, remaining aligned with sort of the democratic values and the fact that they're elected in and out of office. And I think that's going to be the fundamental challenge that they're sort of wedged between.
Martin.
Yeah, I think they'll try to balance. Some countries have more, I think, muscle to do that, such as Brazil. They can play a multidimensional strategy. But when push comes to shove, I don't think they're willing to get even more dependent on China or Russia. Why? Because they see that when a crisis emerges, when their sovereignty is in danger, where the stability of the regime is in danger, China and Russia are not coming to the help. where is Russia in Cuba now? You know, I wrote a whole report on the Kremlin playbook in Cuba, in a way arguing that Russian influence is pervasive, but now Cuba is blockaded and Russia can't do much about it. Also in Venezuela. Russia sold billions in S-300 missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, and they didn't work. So I think leaders around the region are looking at their partners and think, oh, but why are you not helping out in this way? What are you asking from us? In the end of the day, these are predatory regimes. They are not about bringing economic development to the region, bringing democratic institutions. They're about gaining resources and gaining presence in strategic areas. And I think governments in the region realize that in the long run, they are going to become, they're going to enter in a subservient situation. Maybe they see the US in a similar fashion right now, but I think balancing between the two alternatives, they would go with the US.
Admiral?
The United States is indeed entering a new phase of hemispheric geopolitics and actively seeking to reassert strategic primacy in Latin America, which is fully understandable, through the combination of military presence, economic pressure, regional alliances. This shift to the Donroe Doctrine is evident in the US attempts to regain strategic ground by forging a regional alliance under its leadership, such as the America's Counter-Cartel Coalition. Question is, this approach is far from guaranteed to succeed. It could instead, and I don't have a crystal ball, so it could instead deepen regional divisions and instability. Even alignment on face might not be a real alignment, and any opportunity to disalign could appear. The attachment of Latin American countries to their sovereignty is very deep. And the US strategy is unpredictable and often unilateral, which is sad. Therefore, the response for Latin America countries is likely to be divided. Some nations may align with US priorities, particularly those facing immediate security threats, like heavy narco trafficking, while others will resist what they see as interventionist overreach, opting then for non-alignment. It might also encourage some governments to deepen ties with China, Russia, or external actors to counterbalance US dominance. The effectiveness of the US strategy will depend on how it balances security concerns with respect for sovereignty and international law, especially in the eyes of European countries who are willing to help. We are talking about flows. It's financial flows. Talk about Iran. Iran is using the Hezbollah financing in Latin America. You have the flow of fuel, the Ghost Fleet. So it's a global problem. It's a regional problem and a global problem. The regional problem is probably between bilateral, a mix of bilateral and multilateral. The global problem we have really to work all together, because if you cannot fix one point, and then the problem is shifting to another point. But how cooperative will be the questions, the countries in the region? That's the big question.
So 5 years from now, what does a successful strategy for the West look like in Latin America? Is it a total exclusion of these authoritarian rivals that we're wrestling with now, or is it some form of managed competition with those rivals? 5 years from now, what's it look like? Admiral?
You know what's in our blood? It's sovereignty. So having sovereign countries that can handle the future in the best democratic way they can do, make their choices, less influences, or more cooperation. So this is it might be an idealistic way, but I think this is the way in which we are trying to build our partnerships, helping our partners to gain sovereignty.
Martin, a successful strategy 5 years from now, what's it look like?
Well, I think working together on boosting economic security opportunities, friendshoring supply chains, friendshoring investment opportunities, developing cutting-edge sectors, and locking this region into productive areas of growth. and not only extractive industries and asymmetrical dependencies. If, as I mentioned in the beginning, if we kind of couple the military coercion with actual carrots and economic incentives, these countries don't have really much of a choice, because the natural choice is to get aligned better with the EU and the US.
Brian?
The Admiral and Martin said, said it best. But I guess what I could add is that there are pockets of instability in the region. There are pockets in which violent non-state actors have co-opted the state and have undermined the solvency of those governments, I think, in meaningful ways. And so you see this push towards countering cartels. I think a successful strategy of the West would be to help those countries repel those coercive non-state actors that are undermining the political stability of those countries. I think that's one. I think helping countries in the region, defend against, coercive economic practices. I think about Peru right off the bat, and I think about sort of the role that China plays, for example, in Lima's energy production and distribution, owning, nearly 90%, I think, of Lima's. So how do you liberalize some of those spaces that ultimately render those countries or give those countries less agency to be sovereign, to make sovereign decisions? And I think there are key sectors like strategic mining and digital infrastructure that also need to be very cautious in terms of how they're co-opted by external powers, and that may include the West as well in terms of how we engage, certainly. But I think those are probably some strategic sectors, displacing the cartels and then giving Latin American countries agency by removing some of the economic coercion of external actors.
Well, thank you to the forum, and thank you for your excellent questions. And if you'll join me in thanking our very enlightening panel for this terrific discussion. Thanks.